The night was merciless. The wind howled like a pack of starving wolves, carrying with it flurries of snow that stung the skin like tiny shards of glass. The dirt road stretched endlessly into the dark, swallowed by the blizzard, and on it trudged a lone figure. Clara pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shivering shoulders, but it was useless. Her clothes were already damp, her boots heavy with snow. Each step felt like dragging a mountain. Yet she forced herself forward, too afraid to stop. To stop meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. Her cheeks burned from the cold, but beneath the frost was the deeper burn of humiliation and heartbreak. Memories played against the storm like cruel echoes. Doors slammed in her face, voices sharp of rejection, the feeling of being unwanted in every place she turned. Her own family, the very people who should have sheltered her, had cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. Betrayal was too soft a word for it. It felt like she had been erased, unwanted, forgotten. The snowstorm swallowed her sobs, but she kept walking, stumbling more than stepping. Her mind flickered back to the last conversation with her brother, the way his eyes had turned cold as he said, "You're nothing but trouble, Clara. You can't stay here." That memory was more brutal than the storm. At least the snow didn't lie. It was cruel, but honest. People had been worse. Her legs buckled suddenly, and she collapsed to her knees in the snow. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the cold sinking deeper into her bones. For a moment, she wondered if this was it, if the storm would be the last embrace she'd ever feel. Her eyelashes clumped with ice, and the world spun in white circles around her. But somewhere inside, the spark of survival flared. She couldn't give up. Not yet. She forced herself up, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Ahead, through the blur of snow, she thought she saw a light. Faint, flickering, but there. Hope surged like a heartbeat in her frozen chest. She stumbled toward it, half running, half falling, until the shape of a small wooden cabin began to take form. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, a promise of warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. Her body trembled as she climbed the steps of the porch. Every muscle screamed for rest, but fear gnawed at her too. What if the person inside sent her away, just like all the others had? What if the door slammed on her face again, leaving her to die outside? She stood there shivering, staring at the rough wooden door, her knuckles hovering uncertainly. Finally, with the last of her strength, Clara knocked. Once, twice. The sound was swallowed by the storm, but she prayed someone had heard. Her voice cracked as she whispered through chattering teeth, "Please, please, someone." The door remained closed. For a heartbeat, despair swallowed her. She pressed her forehead against the wood, tears freezing on her lashes. Then, slowly, the sound of footsteps inside. Heavy, measured, like the man of the house had been roused from solitude. The door creaked open a sliver, warm firelight spilling into the night. Clara staggered forward, her lips trembling, her eyes wide with desperation. And there, framed in the glow of the hearth behind him, stood a rugged cowboy, broad shoulders, sharp eyes, and a guarded expression that seemed carved from stone. He said nothing at first, just studied her, as if deciding whether she was real or just another ghost of the storm. Clara's voice broke, fragile and pleading. I have nowhere else to go." And with that, the storm roared behind her, daring the cowboy to make his choice. The wooden door creaked wider, letting a gust of warm air spill out into the storm. Clara staggered forward, her boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. The man who stood before her didn't move immediately. He simply studied her like a stranger would study a threat. His frame filled the doorway, broad shoulders, unshaven jaw, and eyes sharp as a hawk's, eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and trusted too little. This was Jacob Carter. Jacob had lived alone on his ranch for years, and solitude had carved itself into his soul. His days were filled with the rhythm of survival, feeding horses, chopping wood, patching fences, and his nights were swallowed by silence, broken only by the crackle of firewood. People in town called him a recluse. Some even said he carried ghosts from the past. And maybe they were right. Jacob had lost more than he cared to tell, and since then his only rule had been simple: keep the world out. Now, The world had knocked on his door in the form of a trembling young woman. Clara's lips were pale, her hair damp with snow, her whole body shivering as she clutched her shawl. She didn't look dangerous. She looked broken. Jacob's instinct told him to shut the door, to let the storm take care of her, to keep his peace untouched. But something in her eyes stopped him. They were desperate, yes, but also filled with a pain he recognized all too well. He stepped aside silently, jerking his chin toward the fire. Clara entered hesitantly, her relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. The cabin smelled of smoke and leather, lined with shelves of tools, and a table set with one plate and one chair. Everything about the place screamed loneliness. She held herself tightly as if afraid she was intruding in a world not meant for her. Jacob closed the door firmly behind her, shutting out the roar of the storm. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like gravel dragged across wood. "You can stay," he said. "But remember, this ain't love, just shelter." The words landed heavy in the small cabin. Clara lifted her gaze, startled by his bluntness. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the firelight, but the edges of his warning didn't scare her. They hurt. Not because she expected love from a stranger, but because she could hear in his tone that love was something he didn't let himself believe in anymore. "Thank you," she whispered instead, her voice trembling. "Just shelter is enough." Jacob gave a curt nod, moving past her to throw another log onto the fire. Sparks lit the air, casting shadows across his hardened face. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why she was out in the storm, didn't ask what she was running from. And Clara, sensing his silence was not unkindness but survival, didn't volunteer her secrets either. The unspoken agreement hung between them like an invisible wall. No questions. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was a crackle of burning wood and a muffled storm outside. Clara sank down near the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. Her fingers were red, almost numb, and she winced as sensation slowly returned. Jacob, leaning against the table with arms folded, kept his eyes on her in quiet suspicion. She was young, maybe in her 20s, but her eyes carried the weariness of someone older. The silence pressed on both of them, awkward and heavy. Clara wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to form. She did want to annoy him, not when he'd given her the one thing no one else had, shelter. And Jacob, for all his guardedness, found himself oddly unsettled. It had been years since another soul had sat in his cabin. The presence of her small frame by the fire shifted the space, made it feel less like a tomb and more like a home. He didn't like that. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. "There's a corner by the hearth. You can sleep there tonight. Tomorrow, when the storm clears, you'll be on your way." Clara lowered her gaze, nodding quickly. She wasn't about to argue. She had nowhere to go, no plan beyond surviving the night. Still, a quiet ache twisted in her chest at the certainty of his words. Tomorrow, she'd be out in the cold again, alone. Jacob moved about the cabin with efficient motions, pulling down a folded blanket and setting it on the floor near the fire. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "It ain't much, but it'll keep you alive." She accepted it silently, her fingers brushing the rough wool. Her throat tightened with gratitude, but she didn't dare push his patience with thanks he clearly didn't want. Instead, she spread the blanket, curled up on the wooden floor, and let the firelight wash over her. From across the room, Jacob sat in his chair, boots still on, his hat tipped low as if to rest. But his eyes didn't close. He watched the storm beat against the window, his jaw tight, his mind restless. A stranger under his roof went against everything he believed in. Yet when he glanced at Clara, curled small, like a bird trying to weather the cold, something in his chest stirred. He pushed the thought away. "This ain't love," he muttered under his breath, reminding himself of his own rule. Just shelter. But even as the storm raged outside, both of them knew that nothing under that roof would ever be so simple. The storm didn't ease by morning. Snow still drifted down in heavy sheets, blanketing the land outside in a silence so deep it seemed endless. Jacob Carter rose before dawn, same as always, his boots crunching on the wooden floor as he moved about his small cabin. He'd expected the woman to still be asleep by the fire. Instead, Clara was already awake, wrapped in the wool blanket, but sitting upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up when he moved toward the door, his hat in hand. "You're going out there?" she asked softly, her voice still rough from the night's cold. "Animals don't wait on weather," Jacob replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. He pulled his coat tight, the leather creaking with age. "Stay inside." Firewood's stacked by the hearth. Clara nodded, but something inside her stirred, an ache to be useful, not just a burden dropped on his doorstep. Still, she stayed silent, watching him disappear into blizzard. The door closed with a heavy thud, and she was left with the crackle of fire and the hollow stillness of a cabin too big for one soul. By the time Jacob returned, snow dusted his shoulders and his gloved hands were raw from work. He expected to find Clara still curled by the fire. Instead, the small table in the corner held a pot, steam curling from its rim. The smell of hot broth filled the air. Clara stood by the stove, awkwardly holding a wooden ladle, as though she hadn't touched one in years. Jacob paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's that?" Clara glanced at him, nervous but resolute. "Dinner. Or breakfast. I found dried beans and some herbs in your cupboard." He set his gloves down, watching her like she just rearranged the entire order of his world. For years, his meals had been plain, quick, bread, jerky, whatever kept him alive. The idea of someone cooking in his kitchen felt foreign. "You didn't need to," he muttered. "I did," she replied simply, turning back to stir the pot. "You gave me shelter. Least I can do is help." Jacob didn't answer. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, silent. But the faintest trace of warmth crept into his chest at her words. Days folded into one another. The storm stretched longer than either of them expected, trapping them in a rhythm that slowly became routine. Clara began sweeping the wooden floor, tidying the shelves, and preparing simple meals with whatever she could find. Jacob spent his days outside with the horses, chopping wood, or repairing fences when the weather allowed. Evenings were the strangest. The two of them sat across from each other at the small table, the firelight flickering between them. Conversation was rare, almost non-existent. Clara would glance up now and then, trying to read the man who seemed carved from stone. Jacob kept his focus on his plate, but sometimes, just sometimes, his eyes would flick to hers before he caught himself. It was awkward, yes, but not unbearable. There was a quietness to their dinners that felt almost steady, like neither of them needed to fill the silence, because both knew silence too well. One evening, Clara finished her chores earlier than usual. She set 2 bowls of stew on the table and waited for Jacob to come in from the barn. When he finally did, brushing snow from his coat, she noticed how tired he looked, the way his shoulders sagged, the way his jaw stayed tense even at rest. "You work too much," she said without thinking. Jacob froze mid-step, his hat still in his hand. He looked at her, one brow raised, as if no one had dared to speak to him that way in years. "Work don't do itself," he replied flatly. Clara lowered her gaze, embarrassed. "I just meant you carry everything alone. It's heavy. I know what that feels like." For the first time, something shifted in Jacob's expression. His jaw loosened slightly, his eyes softened, but only for a moment. Then he set his hat down and took his seat. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't sharp. It was gentler, threaded with something unspoken. The days continued. Clara's presence became part of the cabin, woven into its rhythm like a thread he hadn't realized was missing. She would hum softly while she cooked, and though Jacob never mentioned it, he found himself listening, an unfamiliar comfort pressing against the walls of his solitude. At night, when the wind howled outside, Jacob sat in his chair, while Clara curled near the fire. Sometimes their eyes met quickly, then darted away. Sometimes, when the shadows played tricks, Clara thought she saw a ghost of a smile tug at the corner of his lips. And then, one night it happened. They were eating in silence as usual, spoons clinking lightly against bowls. Clara, feeling braver than before, tried to lighten the air. "You know," she said softly, "you don't scare me." Jacob looked up sharply, caught off guard. For a heartbeat, He seemed ready to bristle, but something about the way she said it, gently, almost teasing, made the tension break. His lips twitched, the smallest curve forming. It wasn't a laugh, not even close, but it was a smile, his first in years. Clara's breath caught. She didn't comment, didn't dare ruin it, but her chest warmed like the fire had leapt into her ribcage. And Jacob, realizing what he'd just done, quickly ducked his gaze back to his bowl. But he couldn't erase the truth. For the first time in a long time, something in his loneliness had cracked open. That night, Clara lay by the fire, staring at the ceiling beams, her heart thudding softly. The cowboy's rule echoed in her memory. This ain't love, just shelter. Yet in that fleeting smile, in the warmth that lingered after, she wondered if maybe, even if he didn't admit it, Jacob Carter had already broken his own rule. And Jacob, sitting in his chair in the shadows, glanced at her one last time before closing his eyes. His chest felt restless, unsettled, but not in a way that hurt. No, this was something different. Something he wasn't ready to name. But in the quiet cabin, under the weight of the storm, two strangers under one roof had begun to shift into something else. The storm had quieted to a soft hush outside, the snow no longer raging but lying heavy on the ground like a white shroud. Inside the cabin, the fire was the only thing alive, crackling and throwing shadows that danced across wooden walls. Clara sat on the rug near the hearth, her knees pulled close to her chest, wrapped in Jacob's wool blanket. Jacob was in his chair, one hand resting on his knee, the other idly running over the rough brim of his hat. The silence was thicker tonight, not the comfortable kind that had started forming between them, but silence heavy with unspoken words. Clara felt it pressing down on her chest, until she finally drew a breath. "You should know," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I didn't just wander here." Jacob's head turned slowly toward her. His eyes were steady, unreadable, but they urged her on. "I had a home once," she began, staring into the fire as if it might give her strength. "Not much of one, but it was mine. I trusted the wrong people, and when I needed them most, they left me with nothing, worse than nothing. They turned me out like I was dirt under their boots." Her voice trembled, though she tried to keep it even. "I thought family meant protection. Turns out it meant betrayal." She swallowed, the heat of the fire pricking at her eyes. "They called me a burden, said I had no place. So I left, or maybe I was thrown out. It doesn't matter anymore." For a long moment, the only sound was the pop of the burning logs. Clara felt the sting of her own confession, the old wounds reopening. She risked a glance at Jacob, expecting indifference, maybe even judgment. Instead, his gaze was fixed on her, sharper than she'd ever seen, but softened by something almost like recognition. Jacob leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He stared into the flames before speaking. "People do that," he said quietly. "When you need them most, that's when you learn what they're made of." Clara blinked at him. His voice carried no pity, only certainty, like he spoke in the same place she did. Jacob's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed like he would stop there, retreat into silence again. But something in Clara's trembling voice, in the way she sat so small by his fire, cracked open the door he'd kept shut for years. "I was engaged once," he said, his tone low, steady. "Long time ago. Thought I had my life figured. Ranch, marriage, a future." His hand tightened around the brim of his hat until the leather creaked. "She left. Said this life was too hard. Said I was too hard. Didn't look back once." He drew in a slow breath through his nose, as though each word cost him something. "Since that day, I figured best way to keep from hunting is to keep the heart shut. Work don't betray you. Horses don't walk away. Land don't lie." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected that from him. Not the man who carried himself like stone, who rarely let even a hint of emotion slip. His voice carried the same weight hers had, the same ache of abandonment, though he buried it under grit and gravel. The firelight flickered, throwing their shadows closer together. Clara shifted slightly, setting her blanket aside. She wanted to reach out to bridge the inches of space between them, but her hand trembled where it lay on her knee. "I know what it feels like," she whispered, "to give someone everything, only to be told it was never enough. Jacob's eyes met hers, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. The room seemed to shrink around them, the fire snapping, the storm's muffled quiet outside cocooning them in a world of two. Their pain, different stories, same scars, hung in the air like smoke. Jacob shifted forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. "Ain't much comfort in knowing we've both been left behind," he murmured. "No," Clara agreed, her voice soft but firm. "But maybe it means we understand each other more than most ever could." Her words lingered, trembling in the space between them. Clara's hand, small and pale in the firelight, rested on the edge of the rug. Jacob's hand, rough and scarred, hung loosely from his knee. The gap between them was only a breath, only a moment. Their hands didn't quite touch, but the air between them pulsed with unspoken want, unspoken fear. Jacob's fingers twitched once, as though fighting some battle deep inside himself. Clara noticed, her heart pounding, but neither dared to close the distance. Instead, they sat there, tethered by the fire, by wounds too heavy to name, by the quiet recognition that for the first time in a long time, neither of them was truly alone. That night, long after Clara had laid down by the hearth, Jacob remained in his chair. He stared at the dying flames, his jaw set, his chest restless. His fiancée's ghost still haunted him, whispering in the back of his mind. Yet now there was another face, another voice, Clara's, softening the edges of the old scars. And Clara, with her blanket pulled close, lay staring into the glow of embers, her heart echoing with Jacob's words. A fiancé who left a cowboy who shut his heart. She understood him. He understood her. For the first time since her world had shattered, Clara felt the faintest flicker of something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The storm had finally passed. Days of endless snow had given way to a sky clear as glass, the horizon stretching wide and white. Clara stood on the porch one morning, watching the sun melt the drifts into glittering rivulets. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt almost safe. Inside, Jacob saddled his horse for the ride into town, his movements quick, practiced, and silent. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, nervous at the thought. "You'll be back before dark?" she asked quietly. Jacob gave a short nod, tugging at the leather strap. "Just need supplies. Won't be long." His tone was flat, but his eyes lingered on her a beat too long, enough to make her heart jump. By the time Jacob rode into the small town, the saloon's porch was already crowded with men leaning on railings, trading stories like currency. The usual sounds, spurs on wood, horses snorting, laughter too loud, hung in the air. But as Jacob dismounted, the sound shifted. A hush, subtle but sharp, passed over the men. Eyes followed him. A voice, low but clear, drifted across the boardwalk. Herd Carter's got himself company out there on that lonely ranch. Another chuckled. Not just company. A woman. Some say she wandered in during the blizzard. Some say he's hiding her. Jacob kept his head down, tying his horse's reins with slow precision. He didn't rise to bait, didn't even flinch, but he heard every word. Inside the general store, the gossip followed him like smoke. Two women by the flour sacks leaned close, their whispers sharp as knives. Imagine living under the same roof. What would the preacher say? Her reputation's already gone, if it wasn't before. And his? Well, he was always a strange one. Jacob set a tin of coffee on the counter harder than he meant to, making the shopkeeper jump. He paid quickly, voice clipped, and left without a word. On his way out, a man tipped his hat mockingly. "Careful, Carter. Folks say too much time alone with a woman leads to trouble." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. His boots crunched in the snow with a steadiness that belied the storm brewing in his chest. Back at the cabin, Clara hummed softly as she stirred the pot over the fire. The simple domesticity was almost enough to make her forget the chaos of her past. But the moment Jacob stepped in, she felt the tension roll off him like heat. He set the supplies down too roughly, his shoulders rigid. Clara frowned. Something happened. Jacob hesitated. For a man of few words, silence was a shield, but tonight it cracked. "Town's talking," he said at last. His voice was gravelly, low. About you? About me? About us? Clara froze, wooden spoon hovering over the pot. Her chest tightened. What are they saying? He met her eyes, his expression unreadable. That there's a woman in my cabin. That it ain't right. Her face paled. Memories of judgment, of being cast aside before, rushed back like a wave. She set the spoon down slowly, her hands trembling. Of course, she whispered. Of course they'd say that. People always find something to poison. Jacob's fists clenched at his sides. I don't give a damn what they think. But I do, Clara said softly, her voice cracking. I can't survive another town looking at me like I'm filth. The room fell silent, except for the soft bubbling of the stew. Jacob stepped forward, his shadow falling across her. His voice, when it came, was firm, almost fierce. You're not filth. You're not some shame to be hidden. Let him talk. Clara's breath hitched. She lifted her eyes to his, searching for any sign of mockery, any echo of the rejection she had always known. Instead, she found something new, something steady, protective, almost dangerous in its certainty. Why does it matter to you? She asked, her voice shaking. Jacob's jaw worked, his eyes narrowing as though the answer was too raw to speak aloud. Finally, he muttered, Because it ain't their business. Because you're under my roof now. And as long as you're here, he paused, voice roughening. No one touches you. No one shames you. The words settled heavy in the room, like a vow spoken without meaning to. That night, Clara lay awake on her cot by the hearth, staring into the shadows. Every whispered word from town echoed in her mind. Woman without place, woman of shame. But Jacob's voice echoed louder. No one touches you. No one shames you. She turned her head slightly. In the dim light of the fire, she could see him sitting in his chair, hat tipped low, but she knew he wasn't asleep. He sat there like a sentinel, watching over her, guarding more than just four walls. And for the first time, Clara felt a strange, fragile truth settle into her bones. Jacob Carter, the man who claimed love had no place in his life, had just made her a promise far stronger than love. The days after the gossip had been uneasy, but quiet. Clara settled into a rhythm at the cabin, cooking, mending, sometimes even laughing softly when Jacob muttered something dry under his breath. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe the storm of her past had finally passed. But peace, she should have known, was a fragile thing. It began one afternoon, when the distant thud of hooves echoed across the frozen hills. Jacob paused mid-swing of his axe, head lifting sharply. The sound didn't belong to any of his neighbors. Too many riders moving too fast. Clara, inside at the hearth, froze at the same sound. Her blood ran cold. She knew it. She knew that rhythm of pursuit. Moments later, the riders appeared, 3 of them, shadows against the snow, eyes sharp, mouths curled into cruel grins. They rode hard up to the cabin, boots crunching as they dismounted. Clara stumbled to the doorway, her face draining of color. One man tipped his hat mockingly. Well, thought you could disappear, Clara? You belong with us. Time to come back. Her breath came shallow, chest heaving. These were the men she had fled, the ones who had broken her trust, who had made her life unbearable. Every instinct screamed to run, but her body wouldn't move. Jacob stepped forward then, axe still in his grip. His stance was solid, rooted in the snow, his jaw clenched tight. She ain't going anywhere. The tallest rider smirked, spitting into the snow. And who are you, cowboy? Her savior? Don't matter. She's coming back one way or another. Jacob let the axe fall heavy to the ground, the sound sharp in the frozen air. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. He lifted it slow, deliberate, the barrel gleaming in the pale sun. His voice was steel. You've had your say. Now turn your horses and ride out of here. You won't get a second warning. The men exchanged glances, their bravado faltering at the sight of Jacob's steady aim. Still, the leader stepped closer, eyes narrowing. You don't know who you're dealing with. Jacob's lip curled in the faintest trace of a snarl. No, you don't. This is my land. She's under my roof. And I don't let wolves steal from my door. For a moment, silence held, the kind that feels like the earth itself was holding its breath. Then Jacob fired, a warning shot that shattered the snowbank just inches from the man's boots. The horses reared, snorting wildly. The men cursed, stepping back. "This ain't over," one shouted as they scrambled onto their saddles. "We'll be back." Jacob kept his rifle raised, eyes hard, until they vanished into the horizon. Clara's knees gave out the second the last hoofbeats faded. She collapsed onto the porch, breath ragged, tears burning her eyes. For years she had run, hidden, coward. And now someone had stood, for her. Jacob set the rifle down and knelt beside her. His rough hand hovered, uncertain, then finally rested on her shoulder. "They won't touch you. Not while I'm standing." Clara looked up at him, vision blurred with tears. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was broken, trembling. "Why would you fight for me?" Jacob's eyes softened in a way she had never seen before. "Because no one else did. Because you deserve somebody to." Her tears spilled over, hot against her cold cheeks. In that moment, the weight of her loneliness cracked, and something new rushed in. Something fierce, fragile, and terrifying. For the first time in her life, someone had drawn a line in the dirt and told the world she was worth protecting. She clutched his hand like it was the only anchor she had. "No one's ever fought for me before," she breathed. Jacob's grip tightened, steady as the earth beneath them. His voice was low, almost a vow. "Then let this be the first time, and it won't be the last." That night, the firelight danced across the walls of the cabin, but neither of them spoke much. Clara sat close to the flames, arms wrapped around herself, the echo of hoofbeats still lingering in her chest. Jacob sat in his chair, rifle within reach, his gaze never drifting far from the window. Outside, the night was quiet again, but inside, something had changed forever. Clara no longer felt like a guest in Jacob's home. She felt claimed not by force, not by fear, but by the rarest thing she had ever known: safety, and with it, the first dangerous whisper of love. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was just gray and heavy, and the next it cracked open, unleashing sheets of snow that swallowed the land whole. Wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and piling drifts against the porch. Inside, the world shrank to a circle of warmth around the fire. Clara pressed her palms close to the flames, listening to the storm rage. Her body remembered that first night, the terror of being lost, frozen, unwanted. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, Jacob Carter sat across from her, silent as ever, sharpening a knife with deliberate strokes, his presence steady as the oak beams above them. Hours passed with only the storm's roar filling the silence. Clara found her gaze drifting to Jacob again and again, the way the firelight carved shadows across his face, the furrow of his brow that never seemed to ease. He caught her once, and for a moment neither looked away. The air between them hummed, thick with something unnamed. Finally, Clara broke the silence, her voice low. "Feels like the world's ended out there." Jacob's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Maybe it has, but we're still here." The simple words lodged deep in her chest, warming her in a way the fire couldn't. As the blizzard raged, they moved closer to the hearth, sharing the same rug, the same glow of heat. Clara pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, and Jacob, after a pause, lifted the edge to drape it over her more fully. Their hands brushed in the movement. Just a fleeting touch, but it sent a shiver through her veins stronger than any storm. Neither spoke of it, but both felt it. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to embers and the storm still screamed, Jacob set the knife aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice was rough, like gravel dragged across stone. "I told myself this was just shelter." He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dying flames. "That's all I had to give. 4 walls, a roof, nothing more." Clara's breath caught. She had never heard him speak like this. Bare, unguarded, her heart pounded, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thing had slipped free in him. Jacob finally turned his head, and his eyes locked on hers. In them, she saw everything he tried so hard to hide. The scars are being left, the loneliness carved into his bones, the hunger he'd buried for years. His voice dropped to a whisper. But I can't let you go. The words cracked something wide open inside her. For so long, Clara had been nothing but a burden, a runaway, a shadow people wanted gone. And here he was, this hard, stubborn man, saying she was worth keeping. She didn't trust her voice, so she didn't speak. Instead, she reached out, hesitant, her fingers trembling as they brushed his hand. Jacob stared down at the touch, then slowly, deliberately, turned his palm to catch hers. Their hands fit awkwardly, clumsy, as if they both had forgotten what it meant to hold another. The silence between them swelled, deeper than words. And then, as if pulled by some force older than either of them, Jacob leaned in. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat. But she didn't move away. The space between them narrowed until his forehead rested against hers, a pause that felt like eternity. When his lips finally touched hers, it wasn't the fiery, reckless kind of kiss Clara had imagined in girlish dreams. It was slow, fragile, almost reverent. Two people starved of love finally daring to taste it. Tears burned behind her closed eyes, because in that moment she knew her life had shifted, forever. Jacob pulled back first, his breath uneven, his eyes searching hers like he was afraid of what he'd find. Clara's hand rose of its own accord, touching the stubble of his jaw. She smiled through tears she couldn't hide. "You don't have to let me go," she whispered. Something softened in his face, breaking the hard line she had thought unmovable. He pressed his forehead to hers again, holding her hand tight as if anchoring himself to this truth. The storm outside howled, but inside, another storm had broken, one that had raged within both of them for years, finally set free. Neither spoke much after that. They didn't need to. They sat together, wrapped in the same quilt, the fire fading to embers. Jacob's arms circled around her, protective yet unsure, and Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart that had once been closed to the world. And somewhere in the middle of that endless night, both of them understood. This wasn't just shelter anymore. This was home. The storm broke at dawn. For the first time in days, the world outside the cabin was still. The sky stretched wide and endless, streaked with pale gold where the sun peeked over the horizon. Snow blanketed the ranch in glittering silence, smooth and untouched, as if the land itself had been remade. Clara stood at the window, breath fogging the glass, watching the light spill over the frozen fields. It should have filled her with relief. Freedom. She could leave now, go anywhere. And yet, her chest ached at the thought. Behind her, the cabin creaked with familiar sounds. Jacob moving about, boots scuffing the floorboards, the faint clink of tools. Clara turned to see him step out onto the porch, coat pulled tight, a hammer in his hand. Curious, she opened the door and followed, the sharp air biting her cheeks. Jacob was at work, steady and focused, fitting wooden slats together. Clara tilted her head. "What are you building?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "A swing. My ma always said a porch wasn't complete without one." His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, a weight, a purpose. She watched him work, the rhythm of hammer against wood blending with the quiet of the morning. The swing took shape, quickly, rough but strong, like everything Jacob built. Clara stood there, torn between awe and confusion, her heart pulling in two directions, one toward the open road, the other toward a man who had become her anchor in the storm. Finally, Jacob set the hammer down. He tested the swing with a firm push, the wood creaking before settling into a gentle sway. Then he looked at her. For a long moment, he just studied her face, as though memorizing every detail. "Clara," he began, voice low and steady, "you came here with nothing. And I told myself I'd give you only what I could, a roof, a fire, a place to catch your breath. Nothing more." Her chest tightened, the same words echoing from that night by the fire. She braced herself, unsure what he would say next. Jacob stepped closer, the morning light catching the rugged lines of his face. His hands were rough, calloused, yet gentle as he reached for hers. "But the truth is," he said, his eyes locking on hers, "I can't imagine this place without you. I don't want you to leave." Not tomorrow. Not ever. Clara's breath caught. Clara's breath caught. The wind seemed to still, the entire world holding its silence. "Jacob," she whispered, unsure if her voice would hold. He squeezed her hands, grounding her. And then, with a raw honesty that left no room for doubt, he spoke the words that would change everything. "Stay. Not as a guest. Not as someone passing through. Stay as my wife." Clara froze, the weight of his vows sinking into her bones. For a heartbeat, she could only stare, her lips parted, tears stinging her eyes. Marriage, a life, a promise she never dared dream of again after so much betrayal, so much loss. Her hands trembled in his. But Jacob didn't let go. His steady gaze, his quiet strength, told her he meant every word. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she had stopped them. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "I'm broken. I carry too much of the past. What if I'm not enough?" Jacob's jaw tightened, but his voice was gentle. "You're more than enough. Clara, I've been alone so long, I forgot what it felt like to live. You brought that back. This ranch, this cabin, it was just wood and stone before you. Now it feels like home." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, rough and reverent. "I don't want perfect. I just want you." Clara's tears spilled freely now, hot against the cold morning air. For so long, she had been running from her past, from herself, from the fear that no one would ever fight for her, choose her, stay. And yet here was Jacob Carter, silent, stubborn, unyielding, offering her the one thing she never thought she'd have again, a forever. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Yes?" Jacob's eyes softened, the hardness in him melting into something she had never seen before. Relief? Hope? Love. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as if he'd never let her go. They stood there on the porch, wrapped in each other, as the swing swayed gently beside them. The land stretched endless before them, the snow glistening, the sky wide open. For the first time in years, Clara didn't see the road ahead as an escape. She saw it as a life waiting to be built, together. That night, as the fire burned low inside the cabin, Clara sat on the porch swing Jacob had made, her head resting on his shoulder. The stars blazed overhead, sharp and bright against the dark sky. The swing creaked softly, the sound blending with the rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. "This cabin was just shelter once," Jacob murmured. "But now it's ours." Clara smiled through the tears that still clung to her lashes, her fingers lacing with his. "Our forever home." And in the stillness of that night, with the swing swaying and the stars bearing witness, Clara and Jacob sealed their vow, not with grand promises, but with the quiet certainty that they had finally found where they belonged.